Right, thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk. I will keep it brief, 10 minutes. So I'm particularly focusing on the Mongolian context because I'm lucky enough to have been working in Mongolia for the past 15 years now, I think. So I just wanted to, in the context of the film that we've just seen, just say a little bit about contemporary Mongolia, just a few key statistics there. So I think to understand what's happening, the potential of community-based management, just need to be aware of a few stats. So a very sparsely populated country. So about 2 people per square kilometre, if we want to average it out. Actually, nearly half that population now live in the capital city in Ulaanbaatar. So when we're talking about the herding communities that we've just seen in the rural areas, it is very spread out across the country. But having said that, these images I put at the bottom, this one here, very famous painting called One Day in Mongolia, which has spawned many copies. But the importance of this, I think, is showing that for the herding communities, this is not an empty landscape or wilderness, it's a lived landscape, and one that's increasingly recognised as populated by non-humans as well as humans. The resurgence of Buddhist and shamanic values over the last 10 or 15 years is also quite notable. And as we think about modern Mongolia, we also need to think about mining. Now, I don't know if people are aware that Mongolia has recently become a very important centre for mining globally. I think one of the copper deposits found in the Gobi Desert is estimated to be the 3rd largest in the world. So we see Mongolia talked about as the new Kuwait. We see it talked about as Minegolia. We increasingly see global mining companies going into the country, and that is driving up the GDP. It is driving up economic growth. But there are issues in terms of these rural areas where mining and herding are sharing land and water resources. So this is part of the challenge that's facing our pastoralist, our herding communities in contemporary Mongolia. And the other challenge that we've heard a little bit about in the film is climate change. And as the film said, Mongolia has one of the highest rates of warming in the world. In the last 60 years, over 2 degrees C average rise in temperature, which is, say, putting it very high up in terms of the impacts of climate change. And as part of that, they're also seeing more extremes, so higher temperatures overall, but also increasingly harsh winters, reduced rainfall in the eastern and central parts of the country. So this is the broader context within which these communities that we saw in the film are trying to find ways to continue and to support their own livelihoods. So what I want to say just briefly is trying to draw out some of the key threads, the key issues that come out of the work I've been doing with partners in Mongolia over the last sort of 10, 15 years, and thinking particularly about this issue of the role of communities, the role of herders working together to try to adapt to some of these challenges. And I think the first thing to say is the kind of herder groups that we saw in that little film we could think of them as quite a recent invention. These are not something that has been present in this form in Mongolia for a long period of time. Now, Durlig Soren, who actually I'm working with at the moment, who's a key NGO leader in pastoral issues in Mongolia, he noted that really since 1999, Mongolia has become something of a testing ground for these community-based solutions to natural resource management. And there's a reason for that, for the timing of that. So 1999 to 2000 was one of these Dzud events the film talked about. Very harsh winter linked to a loss of, I think it was about 10 million livestock died in that winter, which is about a quarter of the national herd, or was at the time. So the impact on local livelihoods was obviously really significant. And as part of that, it gave this pressure for new solutions, for new approaches. How can this livelihood be better supported? And these herder groups primarily came from donors originally, World Bank, UN agencies, Asian Development Bank. This was something that Mongolia, as a very aid-dependent country at the time, was very responsive to these ideas about how communities, herder groups, could support livelihoods into the future. So this idea of communities or herder groups was seen as potentially addressing or helping to address a range of challenges. Environmental change, as I said, a very severe winter, significant loss of animals in 1999-2000, been repeated a number of times since then. Issues with pasture management. Since the end of the Soviet-inspired Nugdel or collective era in 1990, herders very much operating as individual households, trying to bring some higher level organisation back into that system, and also increasing poverty. So at the time there was a small number of very wealthy herding households, but a great deal of inequality and poverty also. So these herder groups, these communities that we saw in the film, was something that really came to the fore 1999-2000 and have really grown since then to cover many parts of the country. And what are they doing, these herder groups, these herder communities? So they're sharing labour, for example, in haymaking, in shearing animals, building and fixing fences, helping each other to move between seasonal pastures. This is what we might think of as a nomadic system originally. The herders move from spring to summer to autumn to winter, depending on which part of the country they live in, how far they move. But it has been a mobile pastoral system. And increasingly, in the late 1990s, 2000, people were staying in one place. It was too difficult, too expensive to move on their own. So could these herder groups bring back that mobility? Diversification. Herders starting to plant vegetables. One member of the group would stay and tend the vegetables. The others would take their animals to graze for them. So these are some of the activities that these herder groups have become involved in, these herder communities. And I think it's fair to say the success has been mixed. Really good examples, again, as we saw in the film. I actually met the guy that was the leader of the herder group who was interviewed, and he epitomises good leadership, strong leadership, a committed membership from the local herding community. But one vital factor is this external support and recognition. So by that, I mean continued support from the donors, from the World Bank, from the UN agencies, but also from the local government agencies. So these herder groups have shown success in some areas in terms of cooperation, in terms of avoiding risk, preparing for harsh winters. But in other areas, they've been a little bit less successful. So it's a model with a real great deal of potential, but I think we also need to understand some of the challenges. And one of the challenges, as I said earlier, is there's no kind of natural community. What you can see here is a herding area in the summer. So you have these groups of gers, the Mongolian tents. If we looked at the same group of herders in the autumn or the winter, they'd be camping next to often completely different people in a different part, in a different landscape. So the boundaries of these social groups are changeable between seasons and over different types of pastures. So you don't have this kind of natural community. It's something that has to be actively created and delineated. So that's one issue. Linked to that, I'm not expecting you to read this, it's in Mongolian and it's also, the handwriting's not great. But the point of that is asking herders about their social networks. Who do you rely on? Who supports you? And what this is showing is, for any one herding household, yes, their neighbours, their fellow herders might be important, but these social networks are very diffuse. They might be their children who've moved to the capital city. They might be relatives in a different district altogether who may allow them to go and graze on their pastures. So what supports the livelihood for many households is not these close, these surrounding households, but also relies on these very extended linkages. And then another challenge, a lot of overlapping, conflicting initiatives. So I said many donors came in and started creating these herder groups in the 1999 onwards. And quite often, the training and the financial support lasted as long as that donor project lasted. So there's an issue with sustaining these. Some of the active groups with the good leadership that we saw in the film have continued, have been successful. Others have fallen a little bit by the wayside. And there's also an issue with if these herder groups are recognised nationally. Some types of these groups, these communities, don't really have any legal status, and their rights to different pastures are contested. What this little diagram is showing, again, it just shows down this side you have different herder communities or herder groups. The colours show how they engaged with different donor projects, UNDP, GTZ, World Vision. When the funding stopped, they stopped. And then they re-engaged with another donor project at a later date. So it's again emphasising that point about continued support and the sustainability of some of these herder groups. Okay, so the herder groups, the communities are potentially really important. They have been very successful in some contexts, but there's been an issue with the sustainability of them in other places. One option that I've been working on with colleagues recently is, can we link these herding communities to carbon markets? So, for example, communities who look after forested areas may be able to get funding for the carbon stored in the trees. What about all the carbon in these grasslands? So one option that we've actually just set up at the moment is linking better management of the pasture, moving more frequently, having fewer animals, to how much carbon there is in the soil. That produces a certificate equal to 1 tonne of carbon that can be sold to support the herder groups. So that's a neat little pilot study we're doing to try and increase the sustainability of some of these herding communities. Working across Mongolia in these 3 different sites. We spent a lot of time going around talking in a lot of detail to the herding households, asking them about what they wanted, what were their desired livelihood strategies, what kind of activities. And from all of this, we came up with, I said, this certificate, which is how much carbon their activities may help to store in the soil, also linked to biodiversity conservation and livelihoods. So it's just one potential way to support these communities in the future. Potential buyers, people who buy Mongolian products. Cashmere, for example, is one of the key valuable products coming out of these herding systems. Anybody who's sitting here wearing cashmere, it probably came from Mongolia. A lot of the value does not go back to the Mongolian herders at the moment, but it is one of the key products coming from these herding systems. So I just wanted to highlight that as one way potentially to support these kind of groups in the future. So just to conclude, challenges of resilience and community-based natural resource management in Mongolia. It's really important that these herding communities, that rights are being devolved to them. They are being given a voice and their knowledge and their skills are being recognised. But having said that, adaptation to climate change and the challenges of environmental change are really important. But we mustn't forget about politics. We mustn't forget about economics. So there's a broader context of who has rights to access the pastures. Increasingly, this is becoming a financial transaction. What are the prices the herders are getting on the markets for their livestock products? Is the government supporting their livelihoods, or are they being considered less significant compared to mining or to other potential drivers of economic growth? What about the recognition of land rights for these herding communities? And some of the bigger infrastructure investments, as the film showed, in the Negdal, in the collective time, there was a very well-organised, managed system which supported this kind of livelihood. So I suppose my final point is, beware devolution of responsibility without rights. We could and we should applaud the innovative, resilient responses of these herders, but we have to recognise that we cannot devolve the responsibility solely to them. We have to think about these wider contexts, and that involves us as well when we think, for example, about the Paris Climate Agreement, when we think about the carbon footprints of your Mongolian herder versus all of us sitting in this room. So we have to appreciate, applaud and support their ability to cope with these challenges, but you also have to recognise the broader system that is creating these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to next hear from Jacopo Pasotti, who was the project lead on the Shared Horizons project. Let me see this up.
So thank you very much. Not being a scientist anymore, but a media person and a science communicator, I think I will go more into actually the scope of this project. I will hook it on the Madagascar, but I will try to give my perspective as a media person and a communicator. So now, it's either milk or fish, or it's either a desert, a huge vast area, a barren land without trees, with a huge horizon, or the sea in the tropics. The story is nearly the same. There are depleted natural resources, environmental changes, social changes, economical changes. Many things are changes. But because of the similarities of stories, evidences which link together communities which are now, as they were before, very much dependent on natural resources, then we decided to go into this. We decided to try to tell a story which could bring together very different communities from very far apart from each other, coming from a very different environment, the desert, the cold, herders dealing with camels, cattle, sheep, or the Madagascar. So fishing in a tropical and very warm, now semi-arid region. But the story we found, they were very similar, and we want to kind of highlight the similarities, especially when we are speaking about adaptation to changes. So it seems that there are both of these communities, and I think that the documentary, the video, which Ross tremendously good prepared for tonight, I think this video shows clearly they have some similarities. They kind of tell a story of communities who are facing some issues, some challenges, or have some shock, some changes due to either the economy or the environment, or both of them. But they are capable, they have some skill of reorganize after the trauma, after the shock, after the change. Reorganizing, getting another organization, is not something to give for granted. But it appears, and there are more and more evidences, that communities living in remote areas, far from the urban environment where we live in, they have skills. to adapt. Actually, they have been adapting for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. So they're probably they're better prepared to adapt to changes than we are. I am dealing with this, I'm interested in this, in the way that some communities are capable of or are trying to adapt to changes since some years now. I've been dealing with the Nenets in Siberia, the Sami people in Scandinavia, some communities in Indonesia, and I'm soon going to Bangladesh to deal with other communities who are trying to adapt to changes. I think it's very fascinating in a way because, as I say, there are more and more evidences that they have skills. However, I mean, if we think of the narrative you have in the media today, especially in the media, but the common narrative that we have when we deal with these communities is that they're vulnerable to changes. It's the narrative of vulnerability, which is true. But they're not necessarily the victims. I mean, they're not the hopeless victims as they are commonly reported in the media. They have some skills. And because I think this vision, this view, this perspective we have, it's not correct, I think there is the scope to present some cases of solutions, which of course we can't give, we can't be sure that they will be successful on the long term, because as you probably know, the changes we are facing today, they are new in history. Changes are now happening very fast, faster than it was in the past, as long as we know from archaeological and historical records. And they're human-driven, so it's something new. So we don't know actually if this success will be long-lasting or not. But there are evidences that at least they are trying to adapt to changes. So that's where the science come in. And that's what I like of the way science can come into this story. And that's what I love of my work as a science journalist. Taking into science in potential provider of some solutions. But as one scientist said in the Madagascar context, science is there to explain how things are happening and give some scenarios, helping the fishermen, the fishers, or the herders to understand that what's happening is not something natural that they can actually frame as it was in the past 1,000 years, but there is some novelty in it, which is how fast is happening, and as I say, the human impact, the human as a driver, say. But once the science comes and explains these issues, it seems that these communities, they have some skills. They will bring their solution themselves, the scientists said. And that's actually, I think, it's a good, it's probably the conclusion I can come to in this my even shorter presentation compared to the one of the previous speaker. First is that science can help them as long as it doesn't come top down, coming with the numbers, the data and the scenarios, and also the solution proposed top down. But when it is a dialogue with the community, it can be extremely effective. And the other conclusion, it's probably something which is more coming from my heart, something from inside. I wouldn't give it as a solid, sound solution. But to me, they appear like a potential model, because these communities, they are trying to adapt. they're trying to develop some strategies. And maybe we could try to filter something for our own huge urban community. I don't know actually what, but there are scientists to do this for us. So, as I say, that was my conclusion. And I actually completely agree with Caroline what she said, that it's important for them to feel, to understand that we appreciate their efforts, that we show respect for their efforts to change, to adapt to changes. And it's very nice what they do in Mongolia now, that either the local, provincial government or the government at large rewards with some prize awards communities who are proving to be successful. It's actually something which feels them more connected with the broader society as. Thank you.